Dave Larson had been a pillar of the Pinehurst business community for over 2 decades. As the CEO of a thriving tech startup, he exuded confidence in charm. His salt and pepper hair and tailored suits a common sight at charity gallows and board meetings alike. Dave's first marriage to Ingrid Bugman had ended in divorce after 10 years, leaving him with sole custody of their daughter, Freya. The split had been amicable, with Ingrid pursuing a career opportunity in the United States and maintaining a distant but cordial relationship with her daughter through occasional visits and frequent video calls. It was at a business conference in Stockholm 5 years ago that Dave met Astrid Nielsen, a vivacious 42-year-old event planner with a quick wit and infectious laugh. Despite their age difference, the attraction was immediate and intense. Astrid's warmth and energy seemed to complement Dave's more reserved nature perfectly. After a whirlwind romance, they married in a lavish ceremony that was the talk of Pinehurst social circles. For the first few years, the Larsons appeared to be the perfect family. Astrid threw herself into the role of stepmother, eager to bond with the then-teenage Freya. She redecorated their home, infusing it with vibrant colors and modern art that reflected her outgoing personality. Dave, for his part, seemed rejuvenated by his new marriage, delegating more responsibilities at work to spend time with his family. Freya, however, remained a somewhat distant figure in the household. At 16, she was navigating the turbulent waters of adolescence. Her relationship with her father strained by his frequent absences during her childhood. Tall and willowy, with her mother's delicate features and her father's intense look, Freya was a quiet, introspective girl who preferred the company of books to people. As Detective Holmberg delved deeper into the family's background, she uncovered a more complex picture beneath the polished surface. Interviews with neighbors and colleagues painted a portrait of a family that, while outwardly perfect, had its share of tensions. Elsa Lindholm, the Larsons' next-door neighbor, recalled overhearing heated arguments in recent months. "They always seem so put together in public," she told the detective, "but behind closed doors it was a different story. I'd hear raised voices, things being slammed. It wasn't my place to pry, but I worried." Dave's assistant, Neil Svensson, provided further insight into the cracks in the family's facade. "Mr. Larson had been working longer hours lately," he confided. "He seemed distracted, on edge. I assumed it was just the stress of our upcoming merger, but now I wonder if there was more going on at home." As Linnea pieced together the family dynamics, she couldn't shake the feeling that the key to unraveling this mystery lay in understanding the intricate relationships between Dave, Astrid, and Freya. Little did she know that beneath the veneer of normalcy, a storm of emotions and forbidden desires had been brewing. One that would ultimately lead to tragedy. Interviews with Astrid's childhood friends revealed a young woman who had struggled with her identity from an early age. Linnea, Astrid's best friend from high school, shared a poignant memory. "Astrid always seemed different," she said, her eyes distant with recollection. "I remember once at a school dance, catching her staring at our classmate Sophie with such longing. When she realized I'd noticed, she looked terrified. We never spoke of it, but I think that's when I understood." Astrid's journey of self-discovery led her to Stockholm after graduation, where she immersed herself in the city's vibrant LGBTQ community. For a few years, she lived openly as a lesbian, even entering into a serious relationship with a woman named Maya Bergstrom. However, the weight of societal expectations and family pressure eventually took its toll. Returning to Pinehurst, Astrid threw herself into her career, bearing her true self beneath layers of professional success and social acceptability. Her marriage to Dave Larson seemed to be the final step in creating the life she thought she was supposed to have. Yet, as Detective Holmberg would come to realize, the heart is not so easily denied. The arrival of Freya into Astrid's daily life would awaken long-suppressed desires and set in motion a chain of events that would end in tragedy. The dynamics of the Larson household underwent a seismic shift in September 2022, when Freya, now 20 years old and starting her second year at the university, moved back home. Her dormitory had been scheduled for extensive renovations, forcing her to seek alternative accommodation. Dave, eager to reconnect with his daughter, suggested she live with them for the academic year. Freya's return home was met with mixed emotions. Dave was thrilled at the chance to rebuild their relationship, while Astrid outwardly expressed excitement about having a youthful presence in the house. However, beneath the surface tension simmered through early. Weeks of cohabitation were marked by awkward silences and stilted conversations. Dave, often absent due to work commitments, missed the subtle undercurrents of discomfort. Freya spent most of her time in her room, emerging only for meals and necessary interactions. It was Astrid who made the first real efforts to bridge the gap, recognizing Freya's passion for literature. She began engaging her in discussions about books, recommending titles, and sharing her own favorites. Slowly, a tentative bond began to form between stepmother and stepdaughter as autumn turned to winter. Freya began spending more time in the common areas of the house. She and Astrid would often be found in the living room, engrossed in conversation long after Dave had retired for the night. Their shared interests expanded beyond literature to art, music, and philosophy. Dave, when he was home, seemed pleased by the growing closeness between his wife and daughter. Yet there were moments when a flicker of unease would cross his face, quickly dismissed and forgotten. Little did anyone realize that this period of apparent harmony was merely the calm before the storm. The bonds forming between Astrid and Freya were deeper and more complex than anyone could have imagined, laying the groundwork for a relationship that would ultimately shatter the foundations of the Lesbian family. As winter gave way to spring, the relationship between Astrid and Freya underwent a profound transformation. What had begun as a tentative friendship, born of proximity and shared interests, evolved into something far more intense and intimate. The change was gradual, almost imperceptible at first, lingering glances across the dinner table, accidental touches that lasted a moment too long, hushed conversations that would abruptly cease. When Dave entered the room, to an outside observer, it might have appeared as nothing more than a close stepmother-stepdaughter bond, but beneath the surface, a current of electricity crackled between them, charged with unspoken desires and forbidden longings. It was Astrid who made the first move. Though later in tearful confessions to Detective Holmberg, she would insist that she had never meant for things to go so far. One evening in late April, with Dave away on a business trip, the two women found themselves alone in the house. They had been discussing a particularly moving passage from Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, when Astrid, overcome by emotion and years of repressed feelings, leaned in and kissed Freya. The moment hung suspended in time, a heartbeat of shock and recognition. Then, to Astrid's surprise and secret joy, Freya kissed her back. What followed was a whirlwind of passion and guilt, stolen moments of ecstasy, followed by periods of anguished self-recrimination. Both women knew the magnitude of their transgression, the multiple taboos they were breaking, yet neither seemed able to stop. They began to orchestrate elaborate schemes to spend time alone together. Freya would invent study groups and project meetings, while Astrid claimed to be working late on event planning. In reality, they would meet in out-of-the-way cafes or secluded spots in nearby parks, reveling in each other's company and the thrill of their secret. Oscar, Freya's friend, noticed a change in her demeanor during this time. She seemed different, he told Detective Holmberg, happier, more alive somehow, but also nervous, like she was constantly looking over her shoulder. I asked her if everything was okay at home, but she just brushed me off. As spring bloomed into summer, Astrid and Freya's affair deepened. What had begun as a physical attraction evolved into a profound emotional connection. They shared hopes, fears, and dreams, finding in each other a kindred spirit long yearned for. Astrid, in particular, felt as though she was finally able to be her true self after years of repression. In Freya, she saw not just a lover, but a chance at the life she had always secretly wanted. Freya, for her part, was experiencing her first real love. The intensity of her feelings, magnified by the forbidden nature of their relationship, yet even as they reveled in their connection, the weight of their deception began to take its toll. Dave, though still largely oblivious, had started to notice small changes in both his wife and daughter. They seemed distant, distracted, and there was a new tension in the air whenever the three of them were together. In early June, things came to a head when Dave announced he would be cutting back on his work hours to spend more time with his family. The news, meant to be celebratory, sent a jolt of panic through Astrid and Freya. Their carefully constructed world of secret meetings and stolen moments was suddenly under threat, as Detective Holmberg would later piece together. It was this announcement that set in motion the final tragic act of the Lesbian family drama. Faced with the prospect of discovery, Astrid and Freya would soon be forced to make choices that would have devastating consequences for all involved. As June progressed, the atmosphere in the Lesbian household grew increasingly tense. Dave, true to his word, had reduced his work hours and was spending more time at home. While he had envisioned this change as an opportunity to strengthen family bonds, he instead found himself feeling like an outsider in his own home. Astrid and Freya, accustomed to the freedom of Dave's frequent absences, struggled to maintain their facade of normalcy under his watchful eye. Their behavior, once easily dismissed, now began to raise red flags. In Dave's mind, he noticed the way they would fall silent when he entered a room. The quick glances they exchanged over dinner, the sudden increase in Freya's study group meetings, and Astrid's late nights at work. Each incident on its own might have been innocuous, but together they painted a picture that left Dave increasingly uneasy. Nils, Dave's assistant, recalled a particularly telling incident at the office. Mr. Lesson came in looking distracted one morning. He told Detective Holmberg, when I asked if everything was all right, he muttered something about Astrid and Freya acting strange. Then he asked me to check Astrid's event planning schedule for the past month. It was an odd request, but I did as he asked. Dave's suspicions continued to grow. He began to pay closer attention to Astrid's comings and goings, noting discrepancies between her stated plans and her actual whereabouts. He found himself scrutinizing Freya's behavior, searching for clues in her expressions and body language. One evening, he overheard a hushed phone conversation between Astrid and Freya, though he couldn't make out the words. The tone was intimate, punctuated by soft laughter and long pauses. When Astrid emerged from the study, her face flushed and eyes bright. Dave felt a cold knot of dread form in his stomach. Driven by his growing paranoia, Dave took steps that he would later be ashamed of. He installed a tracking app on Astrid's phone under the guise of a security update. He began to check Freya's credit card statements, noting several charges at cafes and restaurants when she was supposedly at the university. The final straw came on the evening of June 14th. Dave, claiming to have a late meeting, instead parked his car a block away and watched the house. He saw Freya leave, supposedly for a study session. 20 minutes later, Astrid also left. His heart pounding, Dave followed at a distance. He tracked them to a small out-of-the-way cafe on the outskirts of Pinehurst. Through the window, he saw them sitting close together, their hands entwined on the table. As he watched, Astrid leaned in and kissed Freya tenderly on the lips. In that moment, all of Dave's suspicions crystallized into a horrifying certainty. The two people he loved most in the world had betrayed him in the most profound way possible. Numb with shock and rage, he drove home, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and pain. As he sat in the darkened house waiting for their return, Dave Larson made a decision that would set the stage for the tragedy to come. The evening of June 14th descended upon the Larson household like a gathering storm. Dave sat in the dimly lit living room, a tumbler of whiskey untouched before him, as he waited for Astrid and Freya to return. The ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hall seemed to echo his racing heartbeat, each second bringing him closer to a confrontation he both dreaded and. At precisely 10:43 p.m., the sound of a key in the lock shattered the oppressive silence. Hushed giggles and whispered words drifted in from the entryway, abruptly ceasing as Astrid and Freya realized they weren't alone. Dave remained seated, his back to the door as the two women entered the living room. Astrid's voice tinged with forced casualness broke the silence. "Dave, I thought you had a late meeting tonight." Dave slowly turned to face them, his expression a mask of barely contained fury. "Funny," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I was about to say the same thing to you, Astrid. How was your event planning session?" The color drained from Astrid's face as she realized the implication of his words. Beside her, Freya stood frozen, her eyes darting between her father and stepmother. "I saw you," Dave continued, his voice rising. "At the cafe, I saw everything." What followed was a maelstrom of emotions, accusations hurled like weapons, tearful denials crumbling under the weight of truth, and years of repressed feelings bursting forth in a torrent of words. Astrid, her composure shattered, attempted to explain. "Dave, please, it's not what you think. We never meant for this to happen." Dave roared, lurching to his feet. "But you love my daughter more, is that it?" Freya, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. "Dad, stopped. This isn't just Astrid's fault." Dave shouted, his face contorted with rage and pain. "How could you do this to me?" The argument escalated, years of unspoken resentments and buried truths exploding to the surface. Dave's absence during Freya's childhood, Astrid struggled with her sexuality, the complex web of love and guilt that had entangled them all. Everything was laid bare in those terrible minutes. As tensions reached a fever pitch, Dave, blinded with fury, grabbed the heavy crystal vase from the side table. What happened next would be a source of debate and anguish for all involved. In his agitated state, Dave's grip on the vase slipped. As he stumbled forward, the vase connected with his own temple with a sickening crack. He crumpled to the floor, blood already pooling beneath his head. For a moment, Astrid and Freya stood in shocked silence, unable to process the sudden turn of events. Then, galvanized by the sight of Dave's motionless form, they sprang into action. Astrid rushed to check for a pulse, while Freya fumbled for her phone to call an ambulance. But as Astrid's trembling fingers sought in vain for any sign of life, the horrifying truth became clear. Dave Larson, successful businessman, husband and father, was dead. In the deafening silence that followed, Astrid and Freya looked at each other, their faces pale with shock and dawning horror. The life they had imagined together, already fragile and fraught with complications, now lay in ruins at their feet. In its place loomed the specter of suspicion, investigation, and potential imprisonment. As sirens wailed in the distance, heralding the arrival of a future neither of them had ever envisioned, Astrid made a split-second decision that would seal their fates. "Freya," she whispered, her voice shaking, "listen to me carefully. We can't tell anyone what really happened. No one would believe it was an accident. We need to come up with a story, and we need to do it now." And so, in those frantic moments before the authorities arrived, Astrid and Freya Larson began to weave the web of lies that would ultimately lead to their downfall. In the chaotic aftermath of Dave's death, Astrid and Freya found themselves trapped in a nightmare of their own making. The initial shock of the incident gave way to a frantic scramble to cover their tracks and fabricate a plausible story that would deflect suspicion away from them. With the sirens growing louder, Astrid took charge of the situation. Prevent planning experience, ironically, proved useful in orchestrating their deception. She quickly instructed Freya to wash her hands and change her clothes, then did the same herself. They agreed on a simple story. They had come home to find Dave already dead, presumably the victim of a burglary gone wrong. As the first police officers arrived on the scene, Astrid and Freya played their parts to perfection. Astrid, her face streaked with genuine tears, recounted how they had returned from a late-night study session and work meeting to find the front door ajar and Dave unresponsive on the living room floor. Freya, pale and shaking, corroborated her stepmother's story, adding details about valuable items missing from the house. The initial investigation seemed to support their narrative. The crystal vase wiped clean of fingerprints lay shattered next to Dave's body. Astrid had the foresight to disturb a few drawers and cabinets, creating the illusion of a hasty search by an intruder. She had also hidden some of Dave's more valuable possessions, which she would later discover had been stolen. However, as the hours wore on and the adrenaline of the moment faded, the weight of their deception began to take its toll. Separated for questioning, Astrid and Freya found it increasingly difficult to keep their stories straight. Small inconsistencies began to creep in. The exact time of their return, the order in which they had entered the house, the position of Dave's body when they found him. Detective Linnea Holmberg, assigned to lead the investigation, noted these discrepancies with growing suspicion. Her instincts, honed by years on the force, told her that something about the grieving widow and stepdaughter didn't quite add up. In the days that followed, Astrid and Freya found themselves caught in an ever-tightening web of lies. Each interview with the police required more elaborate explanations, more details to remember and corroborate. The stress began to show in their behavior and appearance. As the investigation progressed, Astrid and Freya's carefully constructed alibi began to unravel. Security camera footage from a nearby street contradicted their stated time of return. A receipt found in Astrid's purse placed her at a cafe across town at the time she claimed to be working late. Each new piece of evidence chipped away at their story, bringing them closer to the moment when their terrible secret would be exposed. Yet, bound together by love and shared guilt, neither woman could bring herself to break their pact of silence. As June drew to a close, the truth of what had happened in the Larson home on that fateful night remained shrouded in mystery, but for Astrid and Freya, the walls were closing in, and it was only a matter of time before their fragile facade crumbled completely. Linnea's first step was to secure the crime scene and order a thorough forensic analysis. As her team combed through the Larson home, she began the process of interviewing witnesses and building a timeline of events. The neighborhood canvass yielded little of immediate value. Most residents reported a quiet evening with nothing out of the ordinary until the arrival of emergency services. However, one neighbor, an elderly insomniac named Sven Gustafsson, recalled seeing a car parked unusually far from the Larson home earlier in the evening. While he couldn't identify the make or model in the darkness, this small detail nagged at Linnea's mind. The autopsy report, when it came in, raised more questions than it answered. The cause of death was clear: blunt force trauma to the head, but the angle of the wound was unusual for an assault. The medical examiner noted that the injury was more consistent with a fall or self-inflicted wound than an attack. As Linnea delved deeper into the Larson family's background, inconsistencies began to emerge. Financial records showed no signs of the economic strain one might expect to motivate a burglary in such an affluent neighborhood. Dave's colleagues described him as distracted and irritable in the days leading up to his death, a marked change from his usual demeanor. Most intriguing to Linnea were the subtle tensions she observed between Astrid and Freya during their interviews. While they presented a united front of grief, there were moments, a glance held too long, a slight hesitation before answering, that hinted at unspoken undercurrents. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a college student, reviewing footage from a traffic camera for an unrelated project. Noticed Dave Larson's car parked near the cafe where Astrid and Freya had met on the night of his death. This directly contradicted their claim that Dave had been at a late meeting. Armed with this new information, Linnea brought Astrid and Freya in for separate interviews. The pressure of maintaining their lies, combined with the shock of this new evidence, began to take its toll. Astrid, normally composed, showed signs of cracking. Her answers became evasive, and she struggled to maintain eye contact. When confronted with the traffic camera footage, she stumbled over her words, unable to provide a plausible explanation. Freya, interviewed simultaneously in another room, fared no better. Her youth and inexperience with high-pressure situations made her an easier target. When Linnea implied that Astrid had confessed, Freya broke down, tearfully admitting that they had lied about the events of that night. However, even as the original story fell apart, both women clung to the assertion that Dave's death had been an accident. They admitted to being at home when it happened, but insisted that he had fallen and hit his head during an argument. Linnea, sensing that she was finally close to the truth, pressed harder. She pointed out the discrepancies in their new story, the unlikelihood of the sequence of events they described. As the interview stretched into the night, the weight of their deception became too much to bear. Finally, in a moment of emotional exhaustion, Astrid whispered the words that would blow the case wide open. With this admission, the true nature of Astrid and Freya's relationship and the real story of what happened that fateful night began to emerge. In the months following the resolution of the Lesbian case, the ripple effects of the tragedy continued to be felt throughout Pinehurst. Astrid and Freya, convicted of obstruction of justice, began serving their sentences in separate prisons. Their relationship, tested by guilt, public scrutiny, and physical separation, faced an uncertain future.